Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. Welcome back to another segment of Disability Weekly. And first off, I want to say Happy Disability Pride Month. 36 years ago in July, we actually had the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a foundational piece of legislation that has helped all of us to be able to live and work in a more equitable manner. So first off, Happy Disability Pride Month, and take a second to recognize the individuals within the community and recognize yourself and reflect on that pride. After all, having a disability is not necessarily a deficit. For many of us, it is an identity, and it's something that has carved the course of our entire career as well as our life and informed much of our unique lived experiences too. So happy Disability Pride Month. And for the record, happy 4th of July coming up tomorrow, 250 years that we can celebrate being a country, the United States of America. Having said all that, I think that we have a really interesting conversation coming up for you today, and that's going to be with my friend Mark, who I met at a Disrupt HR event here in Austin, Texas. And Mark is going to be talking with us a little bit more about what it's like to actually be neurodivergent and also kind of within a larger corporation, and why it is that so often the leaders at the top of the organization are quote unquote neurotypical. In other words, they are embodying the most common and most widely accepted neural traits within the organization and the broader culture as well. And talking a little bit more about what kind of ramifications that has across the broader culture and how we've all come to accept it as well. Really interesting conversation. We don't get to talk about leadership quite as much, but I'm excited about it. Before we get too far, though, please take a second to drop a comment into the chat, introducing yourself, and please connect with the other people that are joining us live today. Thank you so much for being here live to join us. And speaking of being here live, Mark, it's good to see you.
Likewise, Miles, thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get into it. But before we do, please introduce yourself. Who are you and what are you all about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my name's Mark. I spent about 15 years working in the technology space in product leadership, so helping organizations figure out how to build great software to deliver value to customers. And then after a kind of a career transition moment, I actually was late diagnosed as both autistic and ADHD, and that spurred a lot of introspection and chance to look back and think about the challenges I had experienced across my career and where I wanted to go moving forward. And so I launched Neurodivergence at Work as an ability to go and help organizations think about transformation, particularly transformation around supporting neurodivergent employees.
That's fantastic. And I understand too, Mark, from what you've shared with me before, like, could you talk a little bit more about some of the barriers that you experienced, particularly kind of working within larger organizations as somebody who's neurodivergent?
Absolutely. It's interesting looking back, and then of course the stories I hear from clients and folks that I work with every single day. So many of the challenges revolve around mistaken perception and mistaken conception of what it means when somebody behaves or acts in a certain way. And so something that we believe is completely innocuous or is very positive might be perceived in a very different light. And something that I came across repeatedly is differences in communication style. And so where perhaps I might prefer to communicate rather directly, say what I think, say what I mean, I ran into many leaders who prefer a much more indirect communication style. And that often led to conflict where I was coached or instructed or told that I needed to not be so direct, rather than kind of accepting and celebrating that we all communicate a little bit differently and that that's actually a benefit for many organizations. One of the other major challenges I ran into repeatedly is kind of a sensory suite of challenges. And so something that we often don't think about is each of us interprets the sensations that we receive, whether that's sight, sound, smells, touch, in very different ways. We have our own internal experience and we think that might be normal, but somebody else might be experiencing those sensations very, very differently. And so something like background noise or air conditioning noise or some other kind of ongoing repetitive noise in an open office environment can be very draining. I find that just exhausting because I'm constantly thinking about and hearing that noise rather than being able to focus on what I'm trying to get done. And
You know,
those sorts of, oh, I'm sorry, please.
no, going back to your comment around communication and directness too, I keep going back to Grant Harris, who I interviewed previously for this show, and his best advice to organizations is ensure that your communication is clear, concise, and consistent. And I keep going back to those three C's because if we had clear, concise, and consistent communication, it would alleviate so many different problems for neurodiverse people as well as many other people that find barriers within your workplace as well, because there is so many unwritten rules that really dictate our actions and interactions within the workplace too.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the book Smart Brevity, which conveys a similar message around being clear, concise, and getting that information out where everyone can access it in as easy a way as possible. And when we don't state the norms of the office, how we want to operate, when we don't share information in a clear and concise way, it can make it very difficult, not just for neurodivergent individuals, but for all employees to really grasp what the organization's goals are. And so I often look to leadership as having to take that first step to say, here's what we want to be, here's how we want to operate as an organization, and role modeling that sort of clear and concise communication.
So, speaking of which, I want to kind of transition to the topic of the day, and that is talking about the quote unquote neurotypical crown, or the tendency where there is many leaders within the organization that are neurotypical. So, please paint a picture for me about what it looks like at the top, and especially from like a diverse brain perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we all have that sort of perception, or at least I do, that when you think about the C-suite of an organization or even kind of the more senior echelon of leaders, there's a political element that's happening there, right? To even get into those roles, there's an element of social conformity. And so being able to look and act and seem like a leader based on a particular perception that perhaps we hold as a society, that sort of societal norm of what a leader looks like. And often it's an element of extroversion, maybe an element of aggression. Certainly charisma comes up quite frequently. And often it's centered around this ability to be front and foremost during a crisis situation, right?
Mhm.
And so we think about, hey, they handled that really terrible situation well, or they were at least visible leading through that situation when something went wrong. Um, and all too often, we don't look at the folks who are preventing those situations from happening, right? They kind of fade into the background. And so there's kind of this multifaceted dynamic happening where if you look and act and maybe have a similar neurological way of thinking as the folks who are already in leadership, they may pick you out and go, yep, you fit the mold, we'll promote you into leadership roles. And it definitely excludes everyone else who might do a superb job at leading, but is being overlooked.
You know, prior to this, you sent me over a number of different articles, and I think the one that kind of stuck with me was talking about the consistency of the groupthink that occurs,
Mhm.
where they surveyed many, many people across many organizations, and they found dramatically similar results. And break that down for me, like exactly what did they see, like across all these organizations, all these individuals, across a wide range of time, too?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I think, human nature that we want to be around people who make us comfortable.
Mhm.
And so when somebody isn't rocking the boat, so to speak, they aren't contradicting our ideas or way of thinking, then we're more comfortable with them. We want to spend more time with them. And that's a very human thing.
Yeah.
And so what we see then in the article you mentioned and in other research is that tendency among leadership to go, well, that person isn't making me feel uncomfortable. They aren't disagreeing with my thoughts. And that makes me feel better about who I am. And so I want to spend more time with them. And we end up with these circles of leaders or groups of leaders who all kind of think the same way and act the same way and very easily succumb to very pervasive groupthink.
Mhm.
And often it's, hey, the CEO said they want to do this thing and nobody's going to challenge him or her on that thing because they're already pre-selected to agree, right? By virtue of being part of that group.
Yeah, they're pre-selected to agree, which is a challenge in of its own right. But then we also have, so it's kind of a dual problem, right? Like where we have people at the top that might be looking down and like projecting a certain amount of um, let's see, quote unquote, normalness. I'm not sure if there's a better word for that and stuff, but they're projecting this as like, this is the organization culture. But then you also have a seeding problem where people are not being selected, they're not being grown into leaders, and they're not kind of growing up to the top. And so it really is kind of like this self-reinforcing cycle. So I guess the question is like, how would we even go about like breaking that cycle so that we can get more people at the top who are neurodivergent, but also create norms where more people can feel like themselves?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it starts at the top. It requires a leader who says, I don't want to take this approach. I want to take a very different approach. I'm reminded of a story I was told about Jeff Bezos early on at Amazon back in 93, 92, 93. A friend of mine joined Amazon pretty soon after that. And he said when Jeff first came in, he hired a bunch of his Wall Street buddies to help him run the organization. And things didn't go so well. They all kind of thought and acted and believed the same things. And then Jeff kind of got rid of all of them and thought, I'm going to bring in folks who think very differently from me. And he brought in individuals from other industries and other backgrounds, and actually saw a great deal of success, as we know Amazon today. And so I think about that sort of example, a leader who's willing to say, yeah, I think I do a good job, I'm smart, I'm capable, but I want somebody who's quite different from me in multiple different facets, to serve as that counterpoint, to help me catch my weak spots, to help me challenge ideas that I might take for granted. And often that involves identifying somebody who perhaps is dyslexic or autistic or has ADHD or any number of other neurodivergent characteristics, as a way of just identifying people who by default, just by the fact of their neurology, think quite differently.
And I think that there are many skeptics out there that would point to a couple of examples of neurodivergent leaders who have come out publicly and self-identified as such too. So we have Richard Branson from
Mhm.
the Virgin companies, but then we also have Elon Musk from Tesla, as well as a number of other companies and Richard Branson's come out as dyslexic, and then Elon Musk has come out as on the autism spectrum and stuff. But how can we take kind of these particular case studies with a grain of salt?
Absolutely. Every individual is going to be different. Every individual has a unique background, a unique education. I have seen some studies suggesting that as much as 35 or as many as 35% of entrepreneurs may be dyslexic.
Mhm.
Quite a bit of robust data there when it's maybe, I think the best I've seen is 7 to 8% of the population is dyslexic. So we see a very high rate of creativity and entrepreneurship among that group. And I think we run into a little bit of survivorship bias, right?
Mhm.
That idea that one person making it to the top does not mean that everyone is suited for it. Doesn't even mean that that person is really suited for it.
Mhm.
And so there are many capable autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, and other neurodivergent leaders out there who may or may not have self-identified. I think what we see that's really interesting is among those groups, certain traits that are very positive for leadership are dominant. And whether we see those in somebody like Elon Musk, I think is up for question. But it doesn't mean that everyone with that label should be disqualified or qualified one way or the other. I think the piece that I would push or recommend is, hey, every individual deserves a chance. And if you're really looking to drive innovation and creativity and growth and more efficiency in your organization, hiring somebody who doesn't think like you, doesn't look like you is a huge step in the right direction.
Do we typically only tend to promote into leadership roles, say, for example, people with autism who are able to mask effectively?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a strong bias there around preferring somebody again who makes us feel comfortable.
Okay.
And if we're uncomfortable around somebody who maybe is not masking as heavily, that can be a real source of bias for sure. Something that I've seen across multiple situations and in the research as well is even these organizations that have robust programs for hiring in autistic employees, the attitude is sort of like, yeah, we brought them in, we're done. And there's no sort of support and reimagining of like, well, what does the promotions process looks like? What does the performance evaluation process look like? Right? Are we expecting once they're in the door that they're going to act and behave and think like everybody else? Or are we actually going to support them along the way.
And how can we get better at supporting people that may not be able to mask quite as effectively? So I go back and I think about individuals, for example, that may need to STEM, or people that may be nonverbal, maybe people that really struggle consistently to make eye contact or express themselves in ways that are neurotypical. So how can we build organizations that better support and later promote these individuals?
Yeah, I think there's two core facets. There's a thousand things that need to be done, but there's two really important ones. And the first one is making sure that you're focused on outcomes rather than the way people work. And so recognizing that perhaps somebody who is nonverbal or who is going to have a different social interaction with everybody around them, looking at the outcome of their work, the output of their work, rather than how they get it done, becomes really critical. Interestingly enough, that's also best practices just from an organizational psychology perspective. Like, you want to develop your performance evaluation systems to focus on outcomes, not methods. And that's really
Yeah.
important. And then the second piece is making it really easy for each person in your organization to get the support that they need.
Mm.
And that involves training at the managerial level. That involves rethinking things like facilities management and how we provide support and accessibility throughout the office. And it may involve rethinking the way we handle kind of the accommodations request process, right? Are we expecting somebody to divulge a diagnosis, for instance, in order to get support? Or are we just saying we want to give every employee the support they need to do their best work, and coming at it with the kind of that different mindset?
I think that one of the phrases that bothers me the most within hiring circles, as well as within business circles in general, is that concept of culture fit, because I oftentimes think that that is used to screen out people who are different, and we're not exploring why they're different. We're just saying that they're different. And so it's used as a catch-all that oftentimes can be discriminatory, kind of like at the very base level, right there. But how do you have conversations with, say, for example, not only a hiring manager, but also like somebody who, say, for example, manages a small team of people? They've never really thought about neurodiversity. They've never really thought too much about like their role as a hiring manager and maybe some of the legal implications, but also like they haven't been formally trained. Like, how do you have those conversations to say that the attitudes you're perpetuating right here are harming people who are neurodivergent?
Yeah, I think something we don't talk enough about is that managing people is actually really hard, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and there's that allure and that attraction of like, well, I want to get promoted into a managerial role, so A, I don't have to do the hard work anymore, and B, because I
Mhm.
get paid more. And we don't think about the skills and the attributes that are critical for somebody in that managerial role. There's a great line. I think it's Steve Jobs, and I can't quote it exactly, but basically said, the best managers are the people who never wanted to be managers, but who struggled under a terrible manager and thought, well, I better go do this because I'll do it better, right?
Mm.
And that kind of reluctant leadership, I think, often signals a real compassion and empathy for your coworkers and for your direct reports. And so when I'm talking to a manager who maybe is struggling, like you describe, a new manager who's looking for that culture fit, say, hey, your role as manager is to empower and grow a team that's going to perform at a high level. And that involves bringing in lots of different skills, different mindsets, different abilities, different perspectives, different past experiences. And that means for you as a manager, getting out of your comfort zone. It means being more open-minded and adaptable, so that you can support people doing their best work. And so I always encourage, don't think about it as a culture fit, think about it as a culture add, right?
Mm.
What are you adding to your group that you don't already have in the group? What is actually going to be a differentiator for that? And sometimes that's somebody with a disability, whether that's visible or invisible,
Yeah.
somebody who's neurodivergent, somebody with a different set of educational experiences, backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so that's the conversation I love to have with those managers.
Yeah, and it can be challenging, right, too, especially like I think one of the other challenges too is that we'll get individuals that say, well, I've made it despite my own barriers, so why can't you and stuff. And so there's that perpetuating cycle that happens where it's like we're just reinforcing the norm because that's the way it is, even if it was something that held me back and stopped me. But I want to talk about leading from the back, because you talked about those reluctant leaders, but also I think that we can expand that to talking about people that are leading from the back of the organization. They don't need to be front and center, but leading they're doing, like they are empowering those underneath them to be able to perform at the highest level and raise the company up. So I guess, what should leadership look like?
It's such a great question. And I think we have to define what is the purpose of leadership before we can say what it should look like. And
Yeah.
so I think about leadership as, how do you align a group around a goal?
Mm.
Very, very, very simple. But then you also have to start thinking about, well, what happens if I'm not here as the leader? And so leadership involves both alignment, and it involves growing new leaders, right?
Yeah.
Helping somebody else be prepared to step into that role when you're no longer there. And so those are the two pillars that I often think about when it comes to leadership. And for both of those, it's not enough to just say, hey, everybody, this is the goal, to go do it. It involves change management in a lot of ways. And so helping change hearts and minds, helping people grow their own skills, seeing how accomplishing the group's goal also helps further their own personal goals and their own personal development. And along with that, identifying the individuals who are well suited to step into that role as a replacement for you. And
Mm.
so when we think about leadership in that way, I start thinking about traits like learning agility, right? The ability to constantly have that mindset of, I want to learn from this situation rather than control this situation,
Mm.
approaching things with curiosity. And then with your team and with others, approaching with empathy, right?
Mm.
Having that desire to understand what are they going through, and how can I relate to that, and help that person take their next step, whatever that looks like. Um, and then there's an element, of course, of diligence and hard work, right? Leadership is always going to be challenging. So yeah, lots of different pieces there.
And I want to kind of go back to that diversity of minds that is really kind of encapsulated by the concept of neurodiversity. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about particular barriers, but also like particular kind of unique experiences that different subsets of the neurodiverse community might have. So, for example, somebody who self-identifies as having a mental health disorder, such as depression or anxiety, is going to have a dramatically different experience than somebody with autism. And that's going to be very different than somebody with a traumatic brain injury, for example. So, like, what are some of those kind of like range of different experiences that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to start off by saying, like, no two individuals, even with the same condition, are the same, right?
Yeah.
But I'll go through a few to start out. We see consistent research for the autistic community that shows higher levels of, I'll say, ethical or moral behavior, especially when you're not being observed.
Mm.
And so we think about strengths there around always doing the right thing and getting the job done in a way that's the highest ethical standards, which hopefully the organization is going to prioritize.
Yeah.
And I contrast against ADHD, where we see that folks who have ADHD often are extremely good in crisis situations because
Mm.
their brains are dealing with crisis situations every moment of every day. And so when those challenging situations come up, they're often the calmest person in the room.
Mm.
And they help navigate lead the team through that situation with the calm that's needed to help everyone else kind of calm down and handle it one step at a time. And then I would point to the comment I made earlier about the dyslexic community and how we see very high rates of entrepreneurship and creativity and coming up with new ideas there. And so you see all kind of different strengths materializing from different parts of the community. And I think that's exciting. But I'll caveat, right? You might see the exact flip, right? You might find somebody who's dyslexic who shows very high ethical standards, and somebody who's autistic who's extraordinarily creative. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. Each person is going to be different.
Yeah, each person is going to be different. And I think I always add a little bit of a caveat to the idea of entrepreneurialism and stuff too, because I think that that's something to be celebrated, that represents somebody that is willing to go out there and risk it all for the sake of growing a dream. And I think that's incredible. Like, especially here we are celebrating the 4th of July. Like, what is more emblematic of our nation than the spirit of entrepreneurialism? But I think it's also important to recognize there's kind of a sneaky detail that sneaks in within hiring and recruiting, and that is that the more observable that a disability is, and I say observable because like that might be I can see it, or it might mean that I can hear it, or it might mean that I can otherwise witness it in a way that they cannot mask it, they cannot cover it up. They are much more likely to go into business for themselves, especially at a younger age. And this can be a hiring barrier, especially if they don't have the experience to really take it off. Like many small businesses fail every single day, and then they go back into the workforce later and they're trying to start all over again, except now at the age of 30 and stuff too. So entrepreneurialism is important. I think it's something to be celebrated, but I also think we need to recognize why it sometimes happens as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. Anecdotally, I see a very high rate of entrepreneurship among kind of late diagnosed autistic and ADHD individuals. And often it's because they feel like they simply can't go back into the workforce, whether because of hiring barriers or burnout, or having dealt with too many toxic environments. And so entrepreneurship isn't necessarily a dream, it's a survival tactic, right? How do they continue to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads? So I definitely agree. We see those very high rates of entrepreneurship in the neurodiversity community or neurodivergent community, but it's not always, I think, the positive message that we want it to be.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a signal of having no other choices, and yeah, it can definitely be a barrier for them re-entering the workforce. We have those job descriptions we all see, and it's like, oh, 10 years of experience doing this thing. Skills are transferable. I think one of the best things any HR team can do, any recruiting team can do, is to drive a skills first strategy, and move away from those ideas of having to have a certain education or a certain set of experiences, and rather, can this person come in and do this job with or without accommodations, and keep that piece at the forefront.
You know, there's nothing harder right now, especially in 2026 of July, to look for an entry-level job. Well, the only thing that's harder is looking for that job when you're now 40 years old, right? Like, you know, it's very, very different. So just keep that in mind. But I want to kind of go to the people that might be in positions of power right now. Imagine that you are a elderly adult, that you are looking towards retirement, and maybe you're used to seeing your organization a certain way, but you're also recognizing that the future is changing, and you want to set your organization that you've poured your life into to be as successful as possible for when you're gone. So what can they do to try to help make the change that they want to see before they leave?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple pieces here. Obviously, the skills-based strategy for hiring that we just mentioned, to make sure that you're able to bring in a really diverse set of future employees. But then also taking a really careful look at the practices and policies within your organization. What are those norms that have reinforced themselves over time? And maybe they weren't intentional, right? Maybe it was never a deliberate decision to say, this is our attitude or this is our belief. But once you recognize them, there's that opportunity to say, that's not how we want to do things here anymore. It's time to change. Maybe it's always been the policy, but that policy is no longer serving us. And so taking that moment to consider, how do we break down these barriers, whether it's to bringing in outside talent, or it's to maybe promoting that individual internally who does think differently, but is stuck where they are. And so the big pieces I always encourage for those senior leaders is, take a careful look at who you're promoting. Be really thoughtful about what it is that actually makes somebody a good leader, a good manager, and consider whether, are you promoting your top performing salesperson, your top performing engineer into that role, or are you promoting the person who actually has the skill set to be an amazing leader or an amazing manager in that role? It might be your bottom performing person if they're spending all their time supporting their colleagues and helping their colleagues be better. There's this brilliant idea of the no stats all-star. Are you familiar with this, Miles?
No, I'm not.
Okay. It came out, I think, in basketball originally. And the idea is that that player on the team, that when they are on the court, everybody around them plays better. And they may not make a lot of baskets or a lot of rebounds. They may not have an amazing stat sheet, but there's been statistical analysis of certain teams to say, hey, when this player whose stats are not great, but when they are on the court, the team always wins, right? And there were some interesting studies. I think it was of the 2008 or the 2009 Spurs and a few other teams like that to identify these sorts of players. And so bringing that concept over to business and saying, who are your no stats all-stars who are actually making everybody around them better? Those may be perfect candidates for managerial roles, right? Because that is fundamentally the role of somebody to step into that managerial role or that leadership role, is to make everybody around them better. Great framework that I learned going through my MBA program, which was, hey, you expect each additional layer of management to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the group beneath them by 30%. And if your tiers of leadership are not accomplishing that, you have both an organizational design problem as well as potentially a who's getting promoted into leadership problem. And so thinking through how do you properly evaluate that leaders becomes your big next task.
I love that. I love that concept of a no stats all-star and stuff too. Like, how do you measure that? I don't know, but I think that that's a really compelling one for many leaders to consider, especially as they're looking at who is going to help take over and who's going to help guide the organization. Well, before we go though, Mark, I understand you just wrote a book. That's pretty cool.
I did. So I'm the chairman of the board for Umbrella ND. We're a small nonprofit focused on creating resources and support for neurodivergent adults. And we just wrote this book called the Neurodivergent Self-Advocacy Survival Guide. And it's all about how to advocate for yourself as you're going through challenging situations in life, whether that's at work or in healthcare or in your family or other situations as well. And it's accompanied by a huge library of free resources on our website, guides for every sort of different scenario or situation. And all those are freely available even if you don't buy the book, but do encourage you to buy the book. It's part of how we fund ongoing development of new resources. So I'm thrilled to be part of that organization.
I love that. And we'll make sure that we do drop a link to that where you can find that book. But Mark, anything else that you want to say on your way out? For any last kind of parting words to people around the ideas of leadership and neurodiversity?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Miles. I would just encourage you, when you run into that situation where maybe somebody makes you feel just a little bit uncomfortable, they didn't make eye contact the way you expected, or they didn't shake your hand, or maybe they stammered a little bit while they were speaking, whatever it is, take a moment to think, they might be just struggling as much as I am in this situation, trying to show up and trying to engage and have a little bit of empathy and support for them. Their brain may work very differently from yours. They might find something very challenging that you take for granted, like eye contact. And so I encourage just that level of empathy as you go about your day and interact with folks you come into contact with.
I love that. Such a valuable note to part with. Well, everybody, thanks for everybody that did join us not live. Thanks, Yolanda. I see you there in the chat. It's good to see you here again. Until next week. Next week, by the way, Friday at 11:30, we're going to be talking about architecture and going beyond just the ADA requirements. How can you actually build spaces that are supportive of all of your people with disabilities, neurodiversities, and chronic health conditions? I'm really excited because it's such a topic that I really don't know anything about. I do hope you join me again next week, Friday at 11:30. Mark, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Miles. It was a pleasure.
Happy 4th of July, everybody, and happy Disability Pride Month. Take care.